This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Guatemala's President Bernardo Arévalo was almost blocked from taking office after he won his country's 2023 elections. On today's episode, an overview of how Guatemala's democracy and economy are faring after a little more than a year under Arévalo's center-left government.
Yes, we have a very democratic man who has been known for his devotion to peace and building bridges, but a man that's not using power in the way we demand.
It was a little more than a year ago when we were watching, tensely, Bernardo Arévalo's inauguration as the president of Guatemala. Arévalo had been democratically elected with 61% of the vote after campaigning on an anti-corruption platform. But at the time, the opposition was trying everything in its power to prevent him from taking office, including suspending his party and confiscating ballot boxes. Arévalo at the time called it a slow-motion coup. In the end, Arévalo did take office, and some things are going well. Guatemala's economy is expected to grow 4% this year, and the government has passed some important economic and infrastructure reforms. But expectations were high and challenges abound. AQ's latest issue has a special report from Guatemala where we interviewed President Arévalo himself, ministers, members of the private sector, and civil society to try to understand where the country stands. Today's episode will add more layers to this coverage, and I have to tell you, it really is one of the most complicated countries to talk about in Latin America. Very little is black and white. And to give you an example, President Arévalo's popularity has fallen from 78% at the beginning of his term to only 39% in January, according to Sid Gallup. Many Guatemalans who we spoke to said that in their mind the government has been well-intentioned, but slow to act. The demand for change is huge in a country with some of Latin America's worst poverty and an old and decaying infrastructure network that has always limited the country's potential. Meanwhile, even though Arévalo did take office, governability has been a challenge. He has faced 13 impeachment petitions since taking the oath. His biggest rival, Attorney General Consuelo Porras, whom the U.S. government has sanctioned for alleged corruption, remains in that role and seemingly ready to act upon any hint of weakness or wrongdoing. So, what is next for Guatemala? To discuss this, we've invited two guests. The first is Claudia Méndez Arriaza, the editorial director of Con Criterio, who has been a reporter in Guatemala for 26 years. And our second guest is Juan Zapata, director of FUNDESA, a group that represents part of the Guatemalan private sector, who will talk to us about the economy and what to expect particularly on this pressing topic of infrastructure. Let's start with Claudia. So, Claudia, let me start with a broad question here. There was so much tumult around President Arévalo's election and then his inauguration in early 2024. In the broadest terms, how has his government gone since then? What have been the major moments?
Well, there was tumult. There was a lot of questions, uncertainty. And finally, he got to power. It was inauguration, and he was with almost 80% of approval. And then by the beginning of this year, he was in 38%. What has happened? I think that as high as the tumult was, as high as the uncertainty was, as high was the expectations and these hopes that many, many Guatemalans had on Arévalo.
So I want to be clear, this story of high expectations and then a president who loses approval after taking office is a universal story. This is something that has happened in all of our countries again and again. It's part of politics. It has been, for the most part of politics in Latin America, other countries. But rarely has the drama been as strong as it was around President Arévalo because of these circumstances under which he took office. What, in your mind, looking back now at that first year in power, which saw his approval really fall by almost half, what was it beyond the sense of the status quo not changing as quickly as people expected or hoped? What was it that went wrong for him?
As any Guatemalan will respond today to any poll, they have in mind the general attorney that he promised, that he talked about it, that he, expressed it openly, that he wouldn't be able to govern with such a force in the DA's office. That's the reason for, he has fallen so fast. And it wasn't easy. I will say it is not his fault. It was not a decision that he will take from one day to another. It is not a decision as the executive orders of President Donald Trump, And I totally agree with you that this is the story of most of the presidents around the world. But Brian, maybe we have to see why Nayib Bukele has these high rates in the region, because he ordered something in tweet at the beginning of the presidency, and that order took immediately form in front of the citizens. So I think it's the general story in the world of politicians who promise and who, say something, but they can't deliver. But here in the region, we have many that can achieve somehow what they promise.
Yeah, so let's try to unpack this a little bit, because Guatemalan politics could be complicated, especially for people who don't follow them on a day-to-day basis. You mentioned the public's frustration with the Attorney General. That's Consuelo Porras. And she was not appointed by President Arévalo. She was appointed by his predecessor. And she is widely seen as representing kind of the old establishment of Guatemalan politics. This is someone who has been sanctioned by the United States government for alleged corruption, but she remains in office and kind of as an alternate power center in Guatemalan politics, I think would be a fair way to describe it. What has happened with her over this last year plus? I mean, how has she been behaving? Because she was, seen as part of this alliance of forces that tried to keep President Arévalo from taking office in the first place.
Well, she is rejected right now by 9 out of 10 Guatemalans. And you will ask who represents the 1 in 10. They represent the elites. The elites are really, really reduced. They lose the grip of power when Arévalo became the president, but they still have one power, and it's one crucial power. They have the criminal prosecution monopoly, because our constitution and our laws are designed this way. They have the monopoly of the criminal prosecution. So when you have that power, you can have in jail or have an arrest warrant, issue in less than 24 hours to go after a journalist, to go after a judge, to go after a politician. They can go after anybody. And that is what is going on right here. The power that Consuelo Porras and some judges and some magistrates in the judicial system might be reduced. It is at a corner, but it's still a power. And the difference in between the executive power and the judicial power is that executive power can issue some policies, but it takes time for citizens to see the result in their lives. But the judicial system, the power that they have is that they can affect the lives of people immediately.
Claudia, I have frankly found it difficult sometimes to talk about Guatemalan politics over the years, because even kind of summoning the vocabulary is hard sometimes. When you talk about elites and I talk about the establishment, I want to make clear that we're not talking about the entire Guatemalan political class or the entire Guatemalan business community. I think we've seen clear splits in both business leaders taking the side of democracy and trying to work constructively with this government and so on. But what you have described here is a portion of the establishment that is aligned with the current attorney general and that has used that power to criminally pursue some of its rivals. Does that sound broadly accurate to you?
That is an accurate way to put it. I like to use the word islands of corruption, islands of honesty. That's why it is complex. Thanks for saying that. We cannot speak from a general perspective. Who has the power is playing the music now, and sometimes we're hearing this kind of music, and then we hear another kind of music. That is why it is complex.
Claudia, one of the more dramatic recent chapters in this confrontation between President Arévalo and the old guard establishment, if you will, was the recent arrest of Luis Pacheco, who was the Deputy Minister of Sustainable Development of the Ministry of Energy and Mines. Now, Pacheco was the president of a group that led peaceful demonstrations demanding the resignation of Consuelo Porras and respect for the election of President Arévalo. What do we know about his arrest, and what is your interpretation of what's really happening here?
This arrest means what I was talking about, the public ministry. The power that they have, they might be at a corner, but they have a huge power. This is a threat against demonstrations. What we see now, it's what we have seen in 10 years of autocracy, and it's a demonstration that with that power, I mean, it is risky to speak up, it is risky to express, and it is risky to try to prevent the guards and the forces of autocracy and corruption to stop them. That's what it means.
When President Arévalo was elected and when he took office, many of us worried that because of this array of forces lined up against him, that he might not be able to finish his term in office. How are you feeling about his safety as president today? Does this seem like someone who has, despite this context you've described, the ability to stay in power?
Right now, I do believe he has the ability to finish his term right now. But anything is possible here in Guatemala. He's facing so many threats. I have lost the count of impeachments that he has. Last time that I counted, it was 12. That is a threat. You know, finding the court, finding the judge that it's going to open. Okay, but then it goes to Congress. And in Congress, so far, he has been stable so far.
How would you describe President Arévalo ideologically after a year plus in office? Is this a center-left president? And what are the main points on his agenda now?
A moderate left. I will describe him like that. His vocation is of a man of peace, a man of democracy, a man of consensus. National polls show you that the number one strength of President Arévalo is being an honest and a decent man. And the number one fail is not being able to use power. When I try to picture him on a long-term understanding, I have to admit that the President Arévalo is a president of transition. Now, transition to what? I don't know. And I hope the best for the country. But we come from two regimes that were autocrats and corrupt presidents, backed by corrupt parties, backed by a very undemocratic alliance. And he comes and he is a disruptor of all this.
In our cover story, Claudia, we quoted Raquel Zelaya, who's a very well-known political analyst in Guatemala, and she told us that President Arévalo is perceived as, quote, a negotiator, a person of dialogue who bridges gaps, ends quote, but lacking the capability to impose his will and set a course. And she added, she said, that doesn't fit the idea of power and command that we suffered for years. Does that sound right to you?
Exactly. Yes, we have a very democratic, a man who has been known for, his devotion to peace and building bridges, but a man that, it's not using power in the way we demand.
You mentioned building bridges in the figurative sense, but one of the criticisms of this government so far is that it is not building bridges in the literal sense. And after our conversation, we're going to air, as part of the podcast, an interview with Juan Carlos Zapata of FUNDESA, the business group, where we'll talk about the infrastructure challenge in more detail. But when we look at the frustrations that people feel, or the business community feels, with the lack of progress on infrastructure in particular, do you see this as part of President Arévalo's alleged inability to make the political system work on his behalf? Or is there some specific challenge on the infrastructure front that is slowing him down?
It is a mix of everything. I have a source that told me by the end of the year, 2024, a big constructor, that for the first time in maybe 30 years, he was not asked for a bribe for the first time. But then he said, unfortunately, they cannot manage to show, enough ability in the system as the others were. And when he mentioned the others, he meant the corrupted, that they were so used to work with corrupted and with this system that everything moved. But even building a road during an emergency, President Arévalo wasn't, capable of doing it. And, the rains come, and this is a tropical country. So you can get rains in an afternoon that any other will expect maybe in a month, and the roads start to fall. And then you have a ministry that it's not able to work immediately as they did in other times.
Besides infrastructure, what are the main remaining items for President Arévalo's agenda as he looks at the next 2+ years?
Establishing the rules or the base for creating a new public administration, having hospitals with what is needed, having schools with what is needed. I'm talking from a country that 2 years ago or 3 years ago wasn't able to deliver passports to its citizens, wasn't able to have a mail system, a national mail system, and wasn't able to get the vaccines for its citizens during the COVID. So this was 5 years ago. And I know that Arévalo has been, going up in the sense of proving more efficiency in these two terms, but it's too little compared with the needs of the country.
Claudia, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Thank you.
We'll be back after a short break when we'll talk about good news on the economic front and what is being done to address one of Guatemala's most pressing problems, a lack of infrastructure. Hey, it's Brian Winter. If you're in New York on May 19th, we've got a treat for you. Please join America's Society for discussion with the legendary New Yorker staff writer John Lee Anderson. He's John Lee. I think this audience knows him well. Author of the definitive biography of Che Guevara and a longtime reporter on numerous other Latin America-related topics. The conversation will be open to the public. Afterward, there will be a meet and greet with John Lee with wine and appetizers for our valued members of the Americas Society. You can register on our website. That's as-coa.org. That's as-coa.org. Okay, we're back with my friend Juan Carlos Zapata of FUNDESA, the Guatemalan Business Association. Juan Carlos, welcome to the AQ podcast.
Oh, thank you very much, Brian. It's been an honor, and I'm a fairly good listener of the AQ podcast, so thank you for inviting me.
We appreciate it. Juan Carlos, as I mentioned, I want to talk to you about infrastructure. It's a challenge in all of our countries, but I think you'd agree it's a particular challenge in Guatemala. There's this one statistic that was in our new issue that just kind of blew my mind. Guatemala has 19,000 kilometers of roads. That's a little more than 1 meter of road per capita, which is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. Talk to us about why this problem is so pronounced in Guatemala.
Oh, thank you. And just to have a comparison, in the US, you have 20 meters per person. So it's a big difference. And the reason being that Guatemala doesn't have the institutionality nor the capabilities to actually develop projects above $120 million. When you're talking about public roads, ports, airports, you see that most of the infrastructure that was built was done before Guatemala was a democratic country. So most of the major highways, the last ones were done in the 90s, a little bit of the beginning of the 2000s. Last year, the government and Congress approved the infrastructure road bill, which we think can be a starting key point on how to increase infrastructure projects based on building and operating for long-term contracts. And also there is a reform on the PPP law that is still pending in Congress that we think might also increase the opportunities for Guatemala to have large ports, airports, and road systems projects to increase our infrastructure development. Because as you said, Guatemala only invests publicly 1.6% of GDP on infrastructure.
So a lot to unpack there. Let me start with the money part of this. And you indicated that this is not just about money per se, but it's about state capacity, right? It's the ability of the government to execute these kinds of projects. But is it also partly about, I know that in these rankings of tax collection across the region, Guatemala collects significantly less in taxes as a percent of its GDP than other countries. Is that something that has to change as part of this picture as well?
It does, but we don't see that as something that is affecting right now. Actually, Bernardo Arévalo last year had the most funding in the history of the democratic Guatemala since Guatemala has a democracy. But what we are looking at is that there haven't been that much spending and investment on infrastructure. So what tends to happen is that the government at the end of the year has a surplus. That last year they had almost $2 billion of surplus of just funds that they couldn't execute. And that's just because the capabilities of how to invest on large scale projects wasn't there at that point.
So that's amazing that they weren't able to, to spend even the resources that they had. Is the issue then a lack of good projects? Is it a human resources problem? And ultimately, you mentioned this priority road infrastructure law that was recently approved, but what is sort of the holistic way to punch through this problem and get some more roads and other infrastructure in Guatemala?
What we see is that it's basically an institutionality problem, but that has various aspects. So the first one being that even though you have the funding, perhaps you don't have the feasibility studies or you don't have the capabilities to actually execute those projects. Perhaps you have a project that was planned to start this year, but because of different paperworks and just red tape that is within our budget system and how the purchasing operates within the government, it takes them too much time to actually execute the projects. So time just goes by and the projects don't get started. And the reality is that the way that contracts were made before this initiative, it didn't give the government the opportunity to do multi-annual contracts. So most of the projects had to be done in 2, maybe 3 years. This initiative gives the opportunity for the government to do multi-annual contracts for from 25 to 30 years.
The polls for President Arévalo have been dropping pretty steadily since he took office. And one of the things we heard putting together this issue was just a frustration with the slow pace of change. Is this infrastructure issue one that is moving in the right direction? I mean, how do you feel about it in sort of the big picture sense?
It's moving in the right direction, perhaps not at the pace that everybody would like. And that's just the problem. When you look at how other governments had tackled the infrastructure problem, you realize that this is not something new. It's just that because this government has not given maintenance to any road in these first year and almost year and a half that he has, then now the roads are starting to be visibly ill-equipped for all the traffic that you see within the country. So that's right now, infrastructure is one of the main issues that the population is looking for new results. And that is why from the private sector, what we have been pushing for is one, the implementation of the infrastructure bill, and two, the reform of the PPP law that could give the government a new capability to attract foreign direct investment on infrastructure as well.
The macroeconomic picture, Juan Carlos, in Guatemala is pretty good, as it usually seems to be whenever I check in on Guatemala. Inflation relatively low by regional standards, projected at about 3% this year. That's compared to 7.2% in Latin America and the Caribbean. The IMF is forecasting a 4.1% GDP expansion for this year. That's double the LAC average of about 2%. Fitch Ratings Agency recently raised the outlook for debt from stable to positive. How are you feeling about the economy as a whole?
So macroeconomically, the country could grow at 6% if we increase public investment. What we see is that because Guatemala has a urbanization that is still very low in comparison to other countries, urbanization in Guatemala is only 53% of the total population. It is expected to reach almost 80% in the next 20 to 25 years. The average age of the Guatemalan population is 27 years old, so it's a very young population, so it's still growing. But infrastructure is still the missing part of this puzzle when you look at opportunities, not only about roads, ports, and airports, but also hospitals, jails, and everything that has to do with social infrastructure as well. Schools is also very important.
Well, and of course, there's also the question of what makes it to the working class, right? And on some of these figures, they look less good. I mean, you have a poverty rate 55%. That's twice the Latin American average. Labor informality, very high, 83%, second highest in the region behind only Bolivia. And a country where, outward bound migration has slowed a bit, perhaps in part because of things happening here in the United States, but where, these having these good economic figures kind of make their way down to make a difference in people's everyday lives and grow the middle class. That's still the big challenge. I know that's one you and I have talked about before. It's something that you focus on a lot. What has to happen to get there?
Well, I think there's infrastructure is one. The other one has to do with education. There has to be an increase on public spending on public education. And also it has to do with how Guatemala can increase its investment, and specifically foreign direct investment. In order to do so, we need more rule of law, more legal certainty. And I think that what we have been doing through the Guatemala Moving Forward initiative, which is a public and private roadmap for the next 20 years, it focuses a lot on digitalization. And what we have seen right now is that the government has an opportunity to digitalize a lot of services. There was almost 2 years ago an approval of a anti-red tape law, which is basically a law just to digitalize every process within the government. And that should give people the opportunity to be more certain about how to open a business, how to operate with every permit that has to be complied.
Yeah, investors, no matter how big or small, certainty is always what they want. All right. Well, Juan Carlos, thank you so much. Wishing you and Guatemala best of luck.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.